How in the world did a fierce, isolated tribal land transform into the modern political powerhouse we see today? Well, welcome to this explainer. That's exactly the core question we're tackling today. We're going to trace the unbreakable thread of Scottish identity, going from ancient maritime tribes all the way to today's incredibly complex political landscape, just to see exactly how this nation was forged. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for covering about 10,000 years of history. We'll logically trace this evolution through 5 distinct eras: ancient roots and Romans, the rise of kingdoms, independence and the Union, the Industrial Age and wars, and finally, devolution and modern Scotland.
Part 1. Ancient Roots and Romans, the Maritime Tribes. To truly understand Scotland, you really have to first look at its isolating, rugged geography. Now, what's really interesting about this is the staggering scale of time we're dealing with here. The absolute earliest hunter-gatherer settlements date all the way back to 8000 BC. I mean, think about that. These adaptable early populations had to navigate a fiercely challenging environment in what were basically incredibly flimsy crafts, relying on the water just to fish and travel between the islands. And over the millennia, they didn't just survive, they evolved into highly structured communities. Just look at this number. An estimated 2,938 stone circles once dotted the Scottish landscape. That is massive. These weren't just random rocks either. Building those monumental tombs required serious economic inputs and really complex social systems. It tells us that early Scottish society was deeply communal and highly organized right out of the gate. So, fast forward to the 1st century AD, and along come the Romans. Or, actually, scratch that, the Romans run headfirst into the fierce Caledonian tribes. The locals used their rugged terrain to aggressively push back. We're talking about Agricola's bloody campaigns starting in AD 77 and the Battle of Mons Graupius in AD 84. The resistance was literally so intense that by AD 122, Emperor Hadrian decided, you know what, it's easier to just build a massive stone wall to keep these guys out. And it didn't even stop there. By AD 164, the Romans completely abandoned the northern Antonine Wall. They simply couldn't hold it. Moving right along to Part 2, the Rise of Kingdoms, Forging a Celtic Identity. We're jumping to the 11th century now, which was a deeply chaotic but incredibly formative era. Let's look at how power actually worked back then, because this deeply shaped the cultural soul of Scotland. The land was divided into tribal areas, each ruled by a mormaer, essentially a high steward. But here's the kicker. This office wasn't just handed down purely by bloodline. It was an elected position. The clan chose their leader from competing members, meaning leadership was incredibly communal. And that communal mindset bled right into their legal system. Under Celtic law, land was held in common ownership for the mutual benefit of the whole clan. Everyone had a voice. This was completely at odds with the rigid, individualistic feudal system that their southern neighbors in England were pushing. That deep-rooted belief in community authority became an absolutely crucial part of early Scottish identity.
Which brings us to Part 3, Independence and the Union, the struggle for power. And oh boy, that unique identity we just mapped out was about to face its ultimate test. And this brilliantly illustrates the chaos that followed. It was a rapid-fire cascade of dynastic discord. In 1286, King Alexander III dies, leaving Scotland without a clear heir. So English King Edward I tries to swoop in and take control, sparking the brutal Wars of Independence. We've all heard of William Wallace repelling Edward's forces in 1297, right? Well, that paved the way for Robert the Bruce to be crowned in 1306. His military victories ultimately forced the 1328 Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which temporarily secured Scottish independence. But as you might guess, independence didn't last forever. Centuries later, the battlefield completely shifted from military warfare to economic pressure. By the early 1700s, Scotland tried to colonize places like Panama and Orkney. It was an ill-fated, insanely expensive disaster that left the country incredibly vulnerable. Capitalizing on this, England slapped them with a crushing malt tax, monopolizing a vital Scottish industry. This intense economic chokehold basically forced the 1707 Act of Union. That act officially created Great Britain and entirely extinguished the Scottish Parliament. But crucially, it did not erase their distinct cultural identity. All right, Part 4, Industrial Age and Wars, Transformation and Turmoil. Moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, the very fabric of Scotland changes completely. We see aggressive agrarian reforms drastically changing the landscape. As farms modernized and expanded by about a third, it triggered a massive exodus. People flooded out of rural areas and straight into urban centers. This rapid urbanization turned cities like Glasgow into absolute global powerhouses for heavy engineering and textiles. Literally almost overnight, Scotland shifted from a peripheral agrarian society into a titan of the industrial world. But let me tell you, that 20th century economy was a total roller coaster. Glasgow had this dazzling industrial ascent, sure, but by the 1970s, manufacturing fell off a cliff. Bankruptcies and unemployment skyrocketed. But then, right in the middle of all that economic misery, a massive North Sea oil boom from 1971 to 1981 spurred incredible job creation. Talk about economic whiplash. These extreme swings radically altered political loyalties across the country, absolutely setting the stage for the debates we see today. So, let's look at today, Part 5, Devolution and Modern Scotland. The Parliament returns. 1999. This is a monumentally significant year. Remember that Scottish Parliament that was shut down back in 1707? Well, after nearly 300 years and a successful public referendum, it finally reopened in Edinburgh. This process, known as devolution, transferred major domestic powers, things like education and health, right back to Scotland. It was a massive watershed moment, profoundly altering the power dynamic between Edinburgh and London. However, this new political landscape faced a massive shock with the UK's vote to leave the European Union. While the UK as a whole voted for Brexit, a clear majority in Scotland actually voted to remain. The Scottish First Minister famously stated that navigating this post-Brexit landscape could be the most stressful period in modern Scottish history. Now, regardless of where you stand politically, there's no denying this single event dragged ancient questions of national identity and constitutional futures right back to the forefront. So the crucial point is this. If you want to understand modern Scottish politics, you have to understand what the sources call the asymmetrical union. Right now, Scotland has broad domestic independence through Holyrood, but it is still tied to London for major macroeconomic decisions. Westminster retains control over broad fiscal policy and national insurance. This unequal division of power guarantees that the oldest question in the book, who truly has the power to legislate, remains the absolute driving force of their politics today. Which brings us to a final, really fascinating question to ponder based on everything in this explainer. What exactly is the next chapter for Scotland in the European context? We've traced this unbreakable thread from fierce, community-driven Celtic clans fighting off the Romans to a heavy industry titan, and now a modern, devolved nation weighing its options. Will this 10,000-year drive for a distinct identity eventually push Scotland toward full independence and EU membership? Or will the centuries-old union adapt once again? It's a massive question, and one we'll certainly be watching closely. Thanks so much for diving into this with me today.